The moment of truth came not with a storm, not with fire, not with final, dramatic words, but with silence. A deliberate pause. An absence so profound it unsettled the balance of everything she had taken for granted. The irony was bitter. After years of devotion, it was my withdrawal, not my presence, that finally made her notice me. It had been building for a long time, but like all slow-moving disasters, it was easy to ignore. I had spent years filling the void she left, offering patience where she offered indifference, bridging the widening chasm between us with love I was no longer sure she even wanted. And yet, she had expected it. Relentlessly, tirelessly, without question. But love does not thrive in expectation alone. Love is not owed. Love is not infinite when it is given without return. The morning I decided to stop, the world moved on as if nothing had changed. Outside, the city stirred beneath a sky smeared in dull grays and the burnt orange of fading autumn leaves. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the steady rhythm of life continue, untouched by the quiet war inside my home. The streets below filled with early commuters, the hum of engines and distant horns merging into the familiar symphony of another ordinary day. But today was not ordinary. Not for me. Behind me, the sound of soft footsteps signaled her arrival. She moved through the house the way she always did, effortlessly, with the unconscious grace of someone who had never questioned the ground beneath her feet. She stretched, her silk robe slipping slightly from her shoulder, oblivious to the weight of what was shifting between us. "Did you pick up my dress from the tailor?" Her voice was smooth, practiced, an assumption rather than a question. I did not answer. She didn't even notice at first. She was too accustomed to my presence, to my immediate willingness to meet her needs before she even voiced them. But now, something was missing, something subtle yet undeniable. By the time the afternoon sun stretched long across the floor, I saw the first flicker of realization in her eyes. "Did you forget to send the invitations?" she asked, an edge creeping into her voice. Again, I gave her nothing. Silence has a way of growing, spreading its influence into the unnoticed spaces. She had never experienced my absence before, not truly. I had been a constant, a steady heartbeat in the background of her life. But now, my silence became a force she could not ignore. I watched as unease curled around the edges of her composure. The way her fingers hovered over her phone, expecting a message that would not come. The way she glanced toward me in moments when, before, she would not have bothered. Something inside her shifted, but it was not love. Not yet. It was something more primal. It was the recognition of loss before it had fully arrived. At dinner, she sat across from me, poised as always, her movements precise. She cleared her throat, reaching for her wine glass, her gaze lingering on me longer than usual. "Are you upset about something?" A predictable question. A test. She expected me to sigh, to offer her a reason so she could dismantle it with cool logic, with well-practiced dismissal. But there was no anger in me to justify. No fight left for her to counter. I simply let the silence remain. She did not like the quiet. Not when it was deliberate. Not when it came from me. That night, as she settled into bed, I felt her hesitation. The way her breath faltered just slightly before she spoke. "You're acting strange." A statement, not an accusation. Not yet. I did not answer. And in the thick quiet of our dimly lit bedroom, I felt it happening. The slow unraveling. The crumbling of certainty. The weight of my absence pressing down on her, whispering all the things my voice never could. She had expected me to always be there, to always give, to always love without hesitation. But love is not a contract. It is not a duty. And now, in the absence of my effort, she was left with something she had never encountered before. Doubt. And that was only the beginning. The first night of my silence passed without confrontation, but it did not go unnoticed. I could feel the shift in the air, the way her mind worked in the dark beside me. She had never questioned me before, never wondered if I would be there, if I would continue loving her in the same unwavering way I always had. But now, something was different. The morning light spilled through the curtains, soft and golden, brushing over the smooth lines of our bedroom. She stirred before I did, a rare occurrence. I could sense her stillness, the way she lay there longer than usual, as if waiting for something. Normally, I would have kissed her shoulder, whispered something soft against her skin. I would have offered a morning greeting, a small gesture to start the day with warmth. But today I did nothing. I rose without a word, stepping into the bathroom and closing the door behind me. By the time I emerged, dressed and ready, she was sitting up in bed, her gaze following me. "You're leaving early." An observation, not an inquiry. I met her eyes for a moment, but said nothing. Then I walked out. Silence, when weaponized, is not a sharp thing. It does not cut. It suffocates. It lingers in the spaces where words once lived, forcing awareness into every overlooked crevice. And by midday, I could feel her growing discomfort. She sent a message, a simple "everything okay?" I let it sit unanswered. Then another, "Where are you?" A flicker of panic now. She was so accustomed to access, to knowing, to assuming. I had been her certainty for so long that the absence of my response felt unnatural, unsettling. I imagined her checking the time, counting the hours between our last conversation and now. Did she scroll through our past messages, searching for clues? Did she try to remember the last thing she had said to me, wondering if she had done something wrong? I did not respond. The day stretched long, and by evening, when I finally returned, she was waiting. She stood in the kitchen, dressed in something elegant but effortless, as if she hadn't spent the last few hours waiting for me, but I knew better. There was tension in her posture, a stiffness in her spine. "You didn't answer me." This time, it was an accusation. A quiet one, laced with something close to vulnerability. I set my keys on the counter, unhurried. I was busy. The words landed like stones, small but heavy. I saw the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, her lips parting slightly, as if ready to argue, to press further. But she hesitated. She wasn't used to this. She was used to control, to predictability, to the certainty that I would always be there. She had never needed to fight for my attention before. And yet, she didn't fight. Not yet. Instead, she turned away, her silence mirroring mine. I almost laughed at the irony. She thought withholding words would give her power, but silence was my game now. She was only stepping into the world I had already created. We moved through the rest of the evening like strangers inhabiting the same space. She cooked without asking if I was hungry. I ate without commenting on the food. And when the night settled in, we went to bed without speaking. But I could feel her unraveling. In the quiet, in the absence of my reassurance, the walls she had built around her certainty were beginning to crack. She shifted beside me, restless. I waited. Then, finally, her voice, small in the darkness. "You're mad at me." Not a question, a fear. For the first time in years, she was uncertain of me. And it was only the beginning. The silence between us was no longer just an absence of words. It had become something more, a presence of its own, stretching between us like an unseen force. It followed her through the house, filled the spaces where my attention used to be, clung to the edges of every unspoken thought. She tried to pretend it didn't matter. I could see it in the way she moved, the way she carried herself with the same polished grace, as if my sudden withdrawal hadn't unsettled her. But the cracks were forming, small at first, almost imperceptible. The way she reached for her phone, then stopped herself. The way she hovered near me, expecting an interaction that never came. The way she lingered in the same rooms I occupied, as if waiting for the air between us to shift back to normal. But it wouldn't. Not this time. I watched her without watching, noticing the small things. The restless way she picked at the fabric of her dress, the shallow inhale before she walked past me, as if bracing for something. I could feel her mind turning, unraveling the pattern she had always relied on, realizing, perhaps for the first time, how much of her certainty had been built on my effort. She was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to cave, to return to the role I had always played. The man who made things easy. The man who filled the silences before they could stretch too long. The man who smoothed over the sharp edges of her indifference with devotion so unwavering she had never needed to examine what life would be like without it. But I didn't. And so the weight of it began to press in on her. She tried to regain control in the way she knew how. Small manipulations, carefully placed movements designed to provoke a response. I recognized the tactics. A deliberate sigh as she passed me, an expectation that I would ask what was wrong. A carefully chosen dress, one I had always loved, worn without acknowledgement, as if the absence of my reaction would force me to give one. I gave her nothing. The balance was shifting. The nights were the worst for her. In the dim glow of the bedroom, stripped of distractions, she had nothing but her thoughts. I could feel her restlessness, the way she turned onto her side, then onto her back, then onto her side again, each movement more agitated than the last. She had always slept soundly, deeply, unbothered. Not anymore. At one point, I heard her breath catch. Small, barely there, but enough. A shallow inhale, held just a second too long before she released it. A hesitation. A crack in the surface. She was thinking about it now. Thinking about me in a way she never had before. Not as a given. Not as a constant. But as something that could slip away. The power had shifted. And she felt it. But she wasn't ready to admit it yet. Not yet. The unraveling had begun. It was in the way she carried herself now. Each movement more deliberate, more controlled, as if compensating for something slipping just beyond her grasp. She had always possessed an effortless kind of certainty, a quiet arrogance built on the foundation of my devotion. But now, that foundation was cracking beneath her, and she didn't know how to stop it. She tried, in the way she knew. Small adjustments, subtle corrections. A soft hand on my shoulder as she passed. A meal carefully prepared and set before me without a word. She even laughed a little more, feigned ease in a house that had grown too heavy with silence. But I could see the hollowness beneath it all. It wasn't real. It wasn't effortless. It was the beginning of panic wrapped in poise. I let her feel it. The walls of the home we had built together felt different now. She wandered the rooms as if seeing them for the first time, as if noticing how quiet they were without my willingness to fill them. The weight of my absence settled into every corner, every familiar space. I left early that morning, not bothering to say where I was going. The echo of the door closing behind me carried through the house, and for the first time, I wondered if she heard it differently than before, if it sounded more final. I took my time returning. By the time I stepped back inside, dusk had settled over the city, casting long shadows against the walls. I found her in the living room, curled into the corner of the couch, staring at nothing. The air was thick with something unspoken, something she was still too proud to name. I walked past her without pause. For the first time, she flinched. It was subtle, just a small shift in her posture, but I caught it. The weight of being ignored, truly ignored, was something she had never carried before. It wasn't just my words that were missing, it was my presence, my effort, my love. She had expected my devotion to be infinite, unshakable. She had never once considered what it would feel like to be without it. I could feel her watching me now, her silence no longer indifferent, but desperate. There was a question forming in the space between us, but she didn't have the words for it yet. Not yet, but she would. The house was different now. It wasn't the furniture or the decor, not the arrangement of things that had once been carefully curated to reflect an image of perfection. It was the air itself, thick, pressing, suffocating in ways it had never been before. The silence had settled into the walls, into the very foundation of our home, twisting into something neither of us could ignore. She moved through it carefully now, like a trespasser in her own space. The certainty she had once worn like an expensive coat was fraying at the edges, unraveling thread by thread with every step she took. There was no more ease in the way she carried herself, no more quiet arrogance in the way she occupied a room. She was restless. I could feel it in the way she lingered in doorways, her body angled toward me, but never quite stepping forward. The way she hovered near the kitchen when I passed, her hands gripping the marble countertops just a little too tightly. She was waiting, though for what, I wasn't sure. Some kind of resolution? A shift? A return to normalcy? But there was no normal anymore. I had taken that from her. It wasn't done out of malice. There was no grand plan, no strategy behind my absence. It had been an act of self-preservation, of realizing that the person I had been, the one who gave without question, who poured himself into someone who never once considered what it meant to be emptied, no longer existed. And she felt it. At first, she had tried to ignore it. Then she had fought against it in the small, practiced ways she knew how. But now, she was simply enduring it. And the weight of that endurance was crushing her. I watched as she moved through the day with measured precision, adjusting, calculating, reaching for control in places where it had already slipped away. She prepared breakfast without eating a bite. She stood near the window, watching the street below, her fingers tapping against her wrist in a restless rhythm. She checked her phone constantly, not to send messages, but to look at the ones she had already sent, messages I had ignored, conversations I had left incomplete. She was drowning. And yet, she didn't say a word. Pride had always been her greatest strength, and now it was her prison. To acknowledge the shift between us would be to admit that she had been wrong. That she had built her world on the assumption that I would always be there, always be hers, always return no matter how far she pushed me away. But I had not returned. Not in the way she wanted. The realization was slow, creeping in at the edges of her carefully composed exterior. I could see it in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the way she reached for me in small, subconscious ways, her fingertips grazing my arm when passing, a lingering glance held a second too long, a breath caught in her throat when she realized I wouldn't meet her gaze. She was searching for something she had never needed to search for before. Me. The truth settled between us like a storm cloud, heavy with the weight of everything she had refused to acknowledge for years. It wasn't that I had changed. It was that she had never truly seen me. Not as a person, not as someone with limits, with a breaking point. She had only ever seen what I gave. Now, she saw what it looked like when I stopped. It was late when the tension finally reached its peak. The house was dark, the only light coming from the city outside, casting fractured shadows along the walls. I could hear her breathing in the stillness, uneven, shallow. She was awake. So was I? Minutes stretched between us, heavy with things unsaid. And then, a shift. A sharp inhale, a rustle of fabric as she turned toward me in the dark. I felt it before I saw it, the moment she broke. Not in words, not in sound, but in the way the air changed. The weight of realization settling into her bones, the understanding that nothing would ever be the same. She had expected devotion, and now, she understood the cost of losing it. The air between us had solidified into something heavy, something thick with recognition. She felt it pressing down on her now, not just in the moments we were near each other, but in the emptiness that stretched between those moments. She had always been surrounded by my presence, by my love, by my willingness to make things easier for her. She had never considered the possibility of an absence so vast, so consuming, that it swallowed the life she had built without me ever leaving. But that was what this had become. I watched the slow unraveling of her certainty in the way she carried herself now, measured, careful, as if one wrong movement would send everything crumbling around her. The exhaustion had settled into her features. Her spine, once rigid with quiet confidence, now curved ever so slightly, as if the weight of what she refused to acknowledge had finally begun to bear down on her. She had tried, in her way, to fight it. The carefully placed touches, the glances held just long enough to see if I would return them, the small offerings of routine disguised as affection. But she knew as well as I did that it wasn't enough. She was no longer certain of me, and that terrified her. I could see it in the way she lingered near the door when I left the house, in the way she hesitated before picking up her phone, fingers hovering over my name as if she wasn't sure whether another unanswered message would be too much. She was beginning to understand what it meant to wait, to wonder, to question things I had done for years. She had expected unwavering devotion. Now, she had to consider the possibility that she had lost it. She wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. That would mean admitting she had been wrong, that she had taken something precious and treated it as disposable. So instead, she suffered in silence, carrying the uncertainty with her through the hours like an unspoken burden. But I could feel it. The house itself felt different under the weight of her growing unease. She moved through it like a ghost of herself, drifting from room to room as if searching for something, but finding nothing. Meals went untouched. Music no longer played. The television remained off, the usual background noise replaced by a quiet that had taken on a life of its own. She had never lived in silence before. She didn't know how. And so, it began to consume her. At night, I could hear her shifting beneath the covers, the stillness broken by small, restless movements. She used to sleep deeply, unbothered by the world around her. Now, sleep seemed to evade her entirely, leaving her trapped in the hours between dusk and dawn with nothing but her thoughts. The first time I noticed her crying, she wasn't even aware of it. It was a small thing, just the quiet hitch of her breath, the faintest tremor in her exhale. But it was there, unmistakable in the stillness of the room. She was breaking. Not in an explosive way, not in the way she might have if she had still held on to the belief that this could be fixed with a single argument or a well-placed apology. No, this was something different. This was the slow, agonizing realization of what had already been lost. She had always assumed that love, my love, was an endless resource. That no matter what she did, no matter how she pushed or pulled, it would remain. But love is not an infinite thing when it is given without care, without appreciation. Love fades. Love dies. And now, she was left with the wreckage. She had expected devotion. Instead, she was left with silence. And for the first time, she had to wonder if silence was all she would ever have. The end came not in an explosion, not in a final confrontation, but in the stillness of a house that no longer belonged to both of us. The unraveling had finished its course. She had fought against it in the way she knew, small efforts disguised as normalcy, silent pleas hidden in careful glances, but none of it had been enough. The weight of my absence had become something she could no longer carry, and now, it surrounded her completely, pressing into every space where my devotion used to live. I could see it in the way she moved through the house, no longer with purpose, but with quiet resignation. The woman who once commanded every room she entered, who held her certainty like an armor, now seemed to shrink under the reality of what she had lost. She had never prepared for this. She had never needed to. She had always assumed that love, my love, was a constant, something she could neglect and still find waiting for her when she needed it. She had never considered the possibility that one day she might turn around and realize it was gone. Now, she was learning. The quiet had become unbearable for her. I could feel it in the way she lingered too long in spaces she once passed through effortlessly. The way she stopped mid-step, as if forgetting what she had entered a room for. The way she ran her fingers along the edge of the dining table, the back of the couch, as if touching the spaces I used to occupy would somehow bring me back. But I wasn't coming back. Not in the way she wanted. She had spent years believing that love was something she could demand rather than something she had to nurture. That devotion was an expectation rather than a gift. And now, as she sat in the remnants of what she had taken for granted, I saw something in her I had never seen before. Regret. It was in the slump of her shoulders, the unfocused way her eyes drifted over familiar surroundings that no longer offered comfort. It was in the way she reached for her phone, stared at my name, then set it back down without sending a message. It was in the way her breathing changed when she heard my footsteps, only to falter when she realized I had nothing left to give. She had assumed I would always return, but I had already left. Not in the physical sense. My things were still here. My presence still filled the rooms. But the part of me that had loved her without hesitation, without limits, that part was already gone. And she knew it. It was written across her face, in the hollow spaces behind her eyes, in the way she clenched her hands as if holding on to something slipping through her fingers. She had built her world on the foundation of my devotion. And now, that foundation was gone. The truth settled between us like a final, unspoken goodbye. There were no grand declarations, no final attempts to salvage what had already crumbled. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She just existed. Alone. For the first time, she understood what that meant. I watched as she sat there, unmoving, the silence stretching between us like an unbridgeable distance. And then, slowly, I turned and walked away. She did not follow. She knew it was too late. She had expected relentless devotion. Instead, she was left with nothing. And nothing was exactly what she had earned.